Great. Well, good morning, everybody. It's ironic, isn't it? The tech's gone playing up a little bit at an event that's got a particular focus on digital. But actually, I will talk a bit about digital, but I'm no digital expert at all. So my speech will be very different, I think, certainly to the two we've heard and probably to the ones coming up, because I head up HEPI, which is the UK's only think tank that specialises in higher education. And I'm going to take a more helicopter out, if you like, and think a bit more about the policy environment we're in to try and address this question about what HE looks like after the pandemic, including some digital stuff based on our own research. If you haven't come across HEPI, we do loads of reports, loads of events, a free daily blog. Do sign up on our website if you want to be more engaged, I guess, with the wider policy environment, and you can see some of our recent reports and the range of things they cover, hopefully on your screens, from student accommodation to green issues to we've been doing pulse surveys of students during the crisis to how higher education institutions are reported in the media, student finance. You can see the range of things. And perhaps our most well-known project, which we do each year, and I think this does link to one or two of the other things we've heard this morning, is a really big student survey we do. It's been running for 15 years. We do it with Advance HE. It came out just about 10 days ago at our annual conference. And it shows some very, very striking findings, as you know, perhaps you'd expect in the middle of a pandemic. But because it's a longitudinal study that goes back many years, we can really see how different the last year has been to earlier years. So in 2020, we did this survey actually just after the pandemic had started, but everybody thought the pandemic would be short term, wouldn't affect multiple academic years, etc., etc. And it didn't have a big impact on the data. This year, the pandemic's had a dramatic impact on the data. So, for example, the proportion of students, this is full-time students, most of them are young. So it's not all students, it's not postgraduates or anything like that. It's mainly full-time young undergraduates. But nearly half of them say they feel they've had bad value for money, poor or very poor value for money over the past year. That's more than ever before. It's the first time more have given negative answers to that questions than have given positive answers to it. And you can see only about 1 in 4 think they're getting good or very good value for money. So I think that's quite a useful starting point, which does root perhaps some of the conversations already taken place this morning. What in the wider policy environment, even without Brexit, even without COVID, even without the Auger report, which has already been mentioned this morning, we would have just been living through the busiest 5 or 6 year period in higher education policy in the UK there's ever been, probably. And then you've got Brexit, and you've got COVID, and you've got the Auger report on top of all of that. So I think when we're thinking about what the future looks like, it is also worth remembering that we have already for many years been living through a period of really, really profound change, and that's likely to continue. And of course, I mean, neither of the excellent speeches we've heard this morning fell into this trap, of course, but there are people who out there who say nothing will be the same ever again. The whole of education is radically different forever more. And there are other people who say, actually, after the crisis, pretty much everything will go back to how it was before. Just thinking about the people who say everything will change, and I've got 1 or 2 examples of that. I mean, here's a piece from University World News who say the idea of a university rooted to a place, and of course most UK universities have a place in their name and are very rooted in their local communities. This piece in University World News claim that's just going to be history. In future, universities won't be linked to parochial insignias of governments and states. Sorry, I don't know if you may have just seen my email then. Right, got rid of that. So that's one radical view of the future. The World Economic Forum in Davos says the pandemic is as big a profound change as the first industrial revolution, and is going to leave as big a mark on education as the industrial revolution did. The New Statesman, here in the UK, said these are a bit like the arguments that were made about MOOCs, massive open online courses, a few years ago. The New Statesman thinks that technology means we can teach huge audiences at close to zero marginal cost, which will revolutionize the delivery of higher education and research. I don't believe that, by the way. I think a good ed tech is pretty much as expensive as face-to-face very often. But it's worth starting that. I think worth making the point at the start that that is what a lot of people think the world will look like in future. It's not. I'll come on to the things that I do think will change in a second. I don't recognise those really profound, really radically different pictures that have been painted. They all speak with great certainty about what the future will be like, and yet their visions of the future are all different from one another. Close and vague. They're sort of everything's going to change, and it'll be tech related, and it sort of lacks detail. And I think it's worth remembering how often predictions in our sector about the future go wrong. Exactly a year ago, this week last year, the most well-respected think tank in the country, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, had just put out a report saying over a dozen universities are about to go bust. It was based on the idea, which I thought was obviously wrong even at the time, that far fewer people would go to university in the crisis than in a normal year, because they said education is going to be disrupted, so why would people bother going? Forgetting, of course, that everything else is disrupted too, and therefore the alternatives to higher education are also less good. So even if university's not been as good as normal in the last year, well, the alternatives aren't as good either. And of course, the new data that came out at midnight last night from UCAS shows why all those predictions have turned out to be wrong a year on, with record number of 18-year-olds applying to higher education. And actually, whatever politicians say, and of course, there are elements of our government that is rather down on our sector, actually, young people are desperate to go to university in greater numbers than ever before. 100 years ago, Thomas Edison was saying the lecture was dead. The traditional way of delivering higher education was dead. Once cinemas had been invented, why would people bother going to their local university to hear their local lecturer when they could pop along and watch a moving picture of the world's best lecturer in whatever discipline? Well, we know that didn't happen. We know that was nonsense. And I think some research that came out the other day helps to explain, I think, why. So this is very interesting research that we've been associated with, but it's not our research. It's done by Unite Students, but through a proper polling company. And they asked back in 2019, before the crisis, before any of us had heard of COVID-19, but of course COVID-19 is named after 2019, if lectures disappeared, what would you most want to take their place? And back in 2019, the most popular option, just over half of students, 56%, said other face-to-face stuff. And 28%, about a quarter, said other, more digital stuff. So back in 2019, more face-to-face stuff was twice as popular as digital stuff. In 2021, the face-to-face stuff is even more popular, chosen by 2/3, and the digital stuff is less popular. So the ratio is now 3-1. There's now three times as many respondents. It's actually applicants. So these are people who've put in their UCAS form, actually want face-to-face. They're desperate to have face-to-face stuff after the experience of the last year, even though lots of the digital stuff has been fantastic. And this is why, of course, universities are talking about blended rather than wholly one or wholly the other. And our survey that I referred to at the start that came out the other day, 10,000 students, properly representative, we asked if there were no COVID restrictions, how would you prefer to learn? And over half of students say mostly in person, not entirely in person, that wasn't an option, but mostly in person. And only 12% said mostly online, with about a third saying blended. So universities that are saying they're going to go wholly online, and I know actually none are saying that, but that's how the media are reporting some of it. We need to be a little bit careful that we don't get too far ahead of students. And the radical people who say nothing will be the same ever again strikes me. The other reason they're wrong is they're sort of saying that the world as we have lived it in the pandemic, with people learning from home online, is the world students would voluntarily choose if that was the option. But of course, even in the depth of the pandemic, most students had chosen to be back at their university residence, even though the government was advising against that. And most students who did that are happy they did it. So there are politicians, and there's an example of one on the screen, who say, you know, you don't even need school in future. You can just have 400 kids on a Zoom class with the world, you know, with some excellent teachers. It's not going to happen, even though the future won't be identical to the past. And so let's look at some of the things that will definitely be different. One is demand for our sector, whatever policymakers might say or might hope, is going to go on growing. I think we can be almost certain of that. It's been happening for decades, and the number of 18-year-olds is now going to grow for the next 10 years. Ask any teacher, they know that their schools have been expanding over the last few years, and that wave of people is going to hit our sector. It started hitting our sector, and it's going to go on hitting our sector. And of course, the grade inflation we've seen in A-levels and BTECs and others last summer is going to happen again this year, which means more people will be qualified to go, and it'll be very hard for policymakers to unwind that grade inflation too. So one thing that is absolutely certain about the future is we need more places. Our prediction is 350,000 extra places by 2035. So regional demand is an interesting dimension to that, but that's an England figure. And the other reason we're fairly confident that that will happen is 97% of the mothers of young children want their kids to go to higher education. Mothers are particularly influential on children's education. 97% won't go, but it tells you just how immense the aspiration levels inside UK families are. Another thing that's going to continue changing in our sector is our universities, I think, will probably be a bit less autonomous over the next few years than they've been over the last few years. You know, we've seen ministers speaking out even about the curricula, you know, when it comes to decolonising curricula or changing reading lists. We've seen ministers speaking out about free speech and academic freedom issues, and they have a very interesting, their own, perhaps unique perspective on that, currently going through Parliament, of course, a free speech bill. We've got the regulator under the orders of ministers setting baseline requirements for all universities, rather than benchmarking universities against other universities that look and feel like them. I know I don't have very long left, Phil. I've only got a little bit more to say. The other thing we've got to get used to is less money for teaching and learning. There just will be less money for teaching and learning. Politicians are not going to be throwing more money our way, given the state of the public finances, given their desire to spend money on other parts of the education system. Even the best reading of the Auger report, which said fees should come down and Treasury should make up the difference, even the best reading of the Auger report foresaw an 11% reduction in per student funding for home students between 2018-19 and 2022-23. That's the best possible reading of the Auger report. Lots of people think, don't worry, research spending will save the day, particularly if you're a research intensive university. The government's committed to spend 2.4% of GDP on research and development by 2027, public money and private money. Don't believe it. Countries across the developed world have set these targets, and as we've shown on our blog, which is there, 67% of those targets that governments across the world have set have been missed by between 40% and 100%. And another 17% on top of the 67% have been missed by more than 100%. In other words, the country's gone backwards. They've spent less during the period they're meant to be spending more. Don't think research spending is going to come and save the day. I would be amazed if we got close to the 2.4% that politicians say we're working towards. Tony Blair had a 2.5% target for 2014. You can see in the chart research spending, if anything's been going down rather than up. And finally, the thing I worry about most of all about higher education after the pandemic is the return of industrial relations problems to our sector. I think it's disruptive for students, it's bad for staff, it's painful for the people who go through it, both those who are on strike and those who are dealing with the strike. But I think staff are demoralised. They've had so much expected of them during the crisis. The pensions dispute still needs to be resolved at the USS, and there are pension issues elsewhere in the sector too. And of course, the UCU is gearing up for a fight as well. So that's my biggest single concern about HE after the pandemic. And I'll stop there, Phil. Other than my final charge was just to say there's going to be a hell of a lot of policy change in the next few years, just as there's been in the last few years, even if COVID wasn't happening. And there's some of the reasons why. I'll stop there. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you. We have run over by about 3 or 4 minutes, so we don't really have time for questions, but it's been interesting. There have been more comments than questions in the chat, Nick. If you'd be able to have kind of a quick look through that, that would be brilliant. But thank you. That was a brilliant talk. Thank you.